giving Texan law officers the authority to arrest and deport migrants who cross from Mexico illegally. 2 miners have been killed and 8 more are missing after an explosion at a coal mine in Pakistan. A search and rescue operation is underway. The U.S. says it's received mixed signals from Niger after the military government recently revoked an accord allowing American forces to operate in the country. A State Department spokesman said it was seeking clarification. Researchers in the Netherlands say they've been able to eliminate HIV from cells in a laboratory by targeting the DNA of the disease. And Britain's government has banned 15 powerful synthetic opioids, which the health authorities have described as highly addictive and incredibly dangerous. That's the latest BBC World News.
What you're about to hear is based on episode 5 of the Hollywood Exiles podcast, a story about politics, celebrity, and what it means to be American. Left-wing and right-wing movie makers were engaged in a battle of ideas. The FBI is on the lookout for communists, and they're about to engage a powerful new ally. In 1946 in Hollywood, there was a name that commanded respect and fear. The name was Billy Wilkerson. He was the editor and publisher of the industry newspaper Hollywood Reporter, and Wilkerson could make or break careers with the power of print. Wilkerson was ruthless about getting insider information into his paper, information that could make movie stars and studio moguls squirm. He had show business insiders feeding him scoops, and he had mob muscle to strike fear in the hearts of anyone foolish enough to take him on.
A few gangsters, Bugsy Siegel or whatever. Really what we're talking about is the dark, dark underbelly of Hollywood, which is Hollywood politics, which to a certain degree still goes on today. And I think that's just the nature of the beast.
This is Billy Wilkerson's son, William Wilkerson III.
When we think about Hollywood glamour, yes, it was stuff that went on the silver screen. But I would say maybe that was 20%. The other 80% was what took place in real time at these, restaurants and nightclubs and, the town itself.
It just so happened that Billy had a hand in those restaurants and nightclubs as well. He ran a speakeasy through the Prohibition years, and in 1934, he opened Cafe Trocadero, Hollywood's most exclusive restaurant. The glitterati were attracted to the place partly because they knew that an appearance at the Troc would land them in the pages of the Hollywood Reporter the next day. They would often pay their respects to the proprietor. There's a great picture of Cary Grant at the Troc. The star is beaming at Billy like he's a beloved uncle. Whether his connection with the stars was about fear or friendship, one thing is for sure, they needed Wilkerson. Partly for the publicity, but it was more than that.
When they were in a mess, they felt that my dad was the one person in the industry that they could go to for help or for them to be listened to.
And Billy Wilkerson had enough clout to make the problems go away.
There's the incident of Jimmy Cagney, who was just a terrible hellraiser. And in those days, the studios just didn't put up with those, kinds of antics, even though he was a matinee idol.
Jimmy Cagney was a huge star, but he was constantly locking horns with his boss Jack Warner over money and contract demands. Eventually, Warner had enough and had Cagney tossed from the studio lot. He fired him. When he realized that Warner was serious, he turned to Wilkerson. He showed up at the Hollywood Reporter offices and begged Wilkerson to intervene, which he did. Billy called Warner, and Cagney was back to work the next day.
So in that sense, my father had this exclusive ability to help somebody in trouble. Had to hop around the Llewellyn Parsons, they ran columns, and but I don't think that they could pick up the phone and say, Jimmy Cagney's in trouble, give him back his job.
Above all, the Reporter was a trade paper. a place where people in the business could keep up with the latest wheeling and dealing with a healthy serving of gossip. And Wilkerson was not the type of publisher to let others do all the talking for him. He wrote a daily column called Trade Views, which was essentially the world according to Billy.
His daily editorial really put that newspaper on the map. He was saying and writing things that nobody dared to say in Hollywood. And people couldn't wait to get the next day issue because they were waiting to see what this guy was going to say. I mean, a very loose cannon situation, but he created the bully pulpit in order to do that. And he did it well.
Wilkerson had once aspired to run a studio of his own, and he held a grudge against the studio bosses that he believed had conspired to suppress his ambitions. He saw himself as a bulwark against their oligarchy, and he loved to pick fights with them. But in the spring of 1946, Billy had something bigger on his mind. Just like Hedda Hopper and J. Edgar Hoover, Wilkerson had a bit of an obsession with communism.
He had a sixth sense about communism, that it wasn't this beneficent political philosophy. Dad was really worried when, the Allies bartered away the Iron Curtain countries just to keep Stalin happy.
Billy was not a consistent churchgoer, but he held on to a deep Catholic faith. For him, communism was deeply anti-Christian and a force for evil. Even worse, he felt that Stalin had his eyes on America.
He just said, look, I gotta sound the alarm here because this guy has every intention, and Stalin even said so, the way to conquer America is not through force or through the military, but it's through propaganda. And he targeted Hollywood. So that's when my dad became concerned. And he was trying to figure out a way to do it.
The answer came to Billy Wilkerson in the form of a manila envelope delivered to his office one day. Billy had long believed that Hollywood was infested with communists and their sympathizers, agitators more than willing to corrupt the American way through movie messaging. In this envelope, he was convinced he had the proof he needed. It was time to let the world know about communists in Hollywood. Billy Wilkerson was about to start a political wildfire in Hollywood. From the BBC World Service and CBC Podcasts, I'm Una Chaplin, and this is Hollywood Exiles. Episode 5, Billy's List. Mitzi Trumbo was just a baby in 1946, far too young to know that Billy Wilkerson's decision was going to profoundly affect her life.
That's the photo I took of my father in the bathtub that everything is based on now. He didn't ride in the bathtub all the time.
Mitzi is showing me a very famous picture of her father, Dalton Trumbo.
And you remember a film, you have quite how many frames you have? So I was up to 35, and I wasn't going to waste frames. And so there was nobody home. My father was in the tub. So I just went in and shot off the last 3 or 4 frames to use up the film. And my father loved that picture. That's such a good photo. He had a phone by, he'd write on the tiles. If he was talking on the phone, he'd write phone numbers on the tiles behind him. He's the character.
Dalton Trumbo didn't always need to bring his work to the bathtub, but he was busy. If he wasn't working on a screenplay, he was writing an editorial for the Screenwriter Journal, or a speech, or a novel.
My father's work habits his whole life were sort of think about it for a couple of months, and then the day it's due, write it as fast as he could. He was a procrastinator, one would say. Maybe all writers are, right? Well, artists tend to be. So, That was his writing style.
What was your mother like? Your father's a big personality like that, and your mother must have had to hold the reins while he was going through all of that. What was she like?
That was very well put. Holding the reins. I think she was trying. My mother was very calm, peaceful, wonderful woman, and the perfect counterbalance. I think he could have gotten in a lot more trouble than he did if he hadn't been for her quiet advice. She was great. She just kind of held us all together. She was a sweetheart, my mom.
Keeping things together would have been a big job in the Trumbo family. Apart from his work demands, Dalton had very strong opinions.
He was always very political. He was always fighting for union rights, civil rights movement, against their war, Vietnam. These were all dinner table topics. It was how we were raised with all this going on. And dinner table conversations were fascinating. And he always wanted us to speak up and say what we thought, lecture us perhaps about it and things like that. So that was always very energizing, and he was always like that with everyone. He loved being the raconteur. He loved being the center of attention. He should have been a performer. He could also be really difficult, really hard to be around, and all these things. He was just a great big personality, a very interesting man, really. He didn't live long enough. I wish I'd had more years with him.
Lots of families hash out politics over dinner, but Dalton Trumbo's politics went well beyond garden variety Republican versus Democrat stuff. By this time, he was a member of the Communist Party. He'd signed Mitzi's mom up too, and that was a big deal. Consider that in 1947, a Gallup poll reported that 61% of Americans wanted to outlaw the Communist Party in the United States.
The politics of the day were scary.
Dalton Trumbo's beliefs set him and his family on a collision course with powerful forces in the United States. The rising tide of fear and hostility towards communists was thanks in no small part to the FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. And just like Billy Wilkerson, he saw Hollywood as a natural incubator for red ideology. He'd started a file on my grandfather, Charlie Chaplin, as early as 1922. Now he's stepping up the campaign to root out Tinseltown communists. At one point, he fires off some FBI propaganda material to some well-placed show business contacts. A few days later, he gets a note back from gossip columnist Hedda Hopper. I loved what you said about commies in the motion picture industry, writes Hopper. I'd like to run every one of those rats out of the country, starting with Charlie Chaplin. Hoover and Hedda Hopper both have a keen interest in my grandfather, but their legal attacks on him had failed. So now Hoover's sights are set on the wider issue of communists in Hollywood. He strongly suspects they are subversively influencing motion pictures, and he's willing to use pretty dirty tactics to find out who they are.
They are right that there's communists in Hollywood.
John Spartolati is the author of J. Edgar Hoover Goes to the Movies.
They were pretty accurate, not always accurate, but they were pretty accurate. Communist Party headquarters.
July 23rd, 1943. FBI agents broke into the offices of the Hollywood section of the Los Angeles Communist Party.
And they stole Communist Party records, and so they knew who was a communist and who wasn't. I mean, sometimes there was some question because if someone was using an alias, right? But they were overall pretty good at figuring out who was a Communist Party member.
But a list of names only gets you so far. Hoover needs spies and informers to tell him what those alleged subversives and their comrades are up to when they meet. He's looking at groups like the Hollywood Independent Citizens Committee of the Arts, Sciences, and Professions. What a name. It was essentially a group of people who were interested in promoting New Deal politics in the post-war world. Now, the FBI is keeping a close eye on these meetings through an informer called Neil. Neil's brother is actually on the group's board, and Neil is worried about him getting into trouble. He pleads with his brother to step down and leave the group. But it turns out that Neil's brother already has his own concerns about the group's leftist leanings, so he decides to join Neil as an FBI mole. He's given the code name T10, and T10 proves to be a very valuable asset. After meeting with the committee, he dashes to a phone booth on Sunset Boulevard to pass on the latest information, who was in attendance and what they had to say. Exactly the kind of stuff that Hoover was looking for, and exactly the kind of tactics that were leading to an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia in Hollywood. Agent T10 wasn't unmasked until the mid-1980s.
And communism and our own way of life were very much on people's minds, and he was speaking to that subject.
That's when we learned that his name was Ronald Reagan.
I would rather see my little girls die now, still believing in God, than have them grow up under communism and one day die no longer believing in God.
He would carry his anti-communist beliefs all the way to the White House, and in so doing, reshape American policy and culture. Ronald Reagan's subterfuge was adding to J. Edgar Hoover's growing file on Hollywood. The FBI was getting a clearer picture of communist membership and affiliation in Hollywood's creative class. Now Hoover needed a vehicle to get the word out. You're listening to Hollywood Exiles from the BBC World Service and CBC Podcasts. So, this is the atmosphere in Hollywood in summer 1946. The world is still reeling from a world war, and a new war, the Cold War, is just getting started. The fascists have been vanquished, but now Hoover and his allies see a red menace on the horizon. Billy Wilkerson feels the political moment acutely, which is odd in a way. His son says that he was not a conventionally political person.
Well, he never voted in an election in his entire life. For anything. I think that really started in the speakeasy days because he trusted the gangsters more than the politicians. He was one of those people who felt if you made him a promise, you better stick to it. Okay. And we all know that politicians are renowned for breaking their promises because, they want a job.
Wilkerson's revulsion with communism wasn't about the capital P politics. It was a visceral reaction rooted in personal experience.
My dad made a trip to the Soviet Union early in the 20s, didn't like what he saw. He's a Catholic, and so communism goes against his religious values, so that plays into it as well. As a newspaper man, he had a lot more access to news than the person on the street did. And so he started to hear things about Stalin's purges and things like that, which really didn't make the newsreels at that time.
So Billy found a common cause with Hedda Hopper and J. Edgar Hoover, people who saw communism as evil incarnate. And then there was Howard Hughes. Hughes was an early movie tycoon who parlayed movie millions into an aircraft empire. He was a daredevil pilot, a notorious womanizer, and he hated communists. But he really liked Billy Wilkerson, and he was going to help Wilkerson get what he wanted.
So I think he saw in my dad a kindred spirit. I think the formation of their friendship was just really around the industry. It didn't hurt that Hughes was this insatiable playboy. I mean, his libido could never be satisfied. And so my father became one of his procurers. So I think that's how the relationship got started.
So, there was something in it for Hughes. And like most of his relationships, this one was transactional for W2. He had access, but not the kind of access that Howard Hughes did. Hughes was a major employer with a huge public profile. He was a military contractor who was in the room with the rich and powerful.
Howard Hughes could get to anybody. Presidents, FBI, you name it, Hughes could make that happen. And so I think that that's how the two, my dad and Hughes, became allied. My dad knew that if he was going to do any campaign, he couldn't do it without somebody like Hughes who had access to these people who had these documents. Once that relationship was formed, my father would call J. Edgar Hoover and vice versa. And it was said to me that the two were helping each other. Hoover wanted to do something about communism, really didn't know exactly what to do. My dad wanted to do something about it, so one would feed the information, the other would print it front page. So it was the perfect marriage between the two.
Billy wanted to fire his journalistic canons at Hollywood communists, but he wanted hard evidence, not hearsay and speculation.
I think there was a juncture at which my dad knew he couldn't go any further with his communist campaign unless he could have access to government documents. And it's fascinating to me that these guys would drive around all night in the dead of night, in a black Chevrolet and just, talk. And I think in one of these evenings, he popped the question. He said, look, something's come up, and maybe you can help me. And when he told Hughes, he didn't realize how fanatical Hughes was as well. So I think Hughes wasted no time in helping my dad because he was very sympathetic with my dad. So, without Hughes, I don't think my dad could have waged a convincing campaign.
It was not long after that particular late-night drive that the manila envelope arrived at the offices of the Hollywood Reporter. It seemed that Howard Hughes had delivered the goods. We'll probably never know for certain where Hughes got the information, but the suspicion is that it came from J. Edgar Hoover himself. So, in the summer of 1946, Wilkerson goes to print with a series of explosive front-page exposés. "Hollywood's Red Commissars," screamed one front-page headline.